On corruption. Corruption to me means something which is good, wholesome, pure, becomes eaten away and defiled and made corrupted, as in the Bible, where moth and rust do corrupt. Moths take a nice jersey or whatever and start gnawing at it, and it ends up with holes in it. And rust takes a good piece of iron or whatever and eats away at it. So it's that idea that there is something which is good and we can admire and works well, and then something undermines it insidiously, often from the inside. And what it usually means is that you have made a big effort to separate and isolate something, and then it gets corrupted by forces, powers, interests which prevent it from working properly or make it ineffective in many ways. Now, this is a problem which many countries, they tend to look at other people's corruption. They often forget their own. And each different civilization produces different forms of corruption. In modern Western societies, the characteristic form is where you have a notional separation between one aspect, for example, getting a job in a bureaucratic organization or getting into university or examinations or whatever, is supposed to be on your merit and suitability. But if you call in your uncle's nepotism, or call in a small bribe, or use other means than the appropriate and formal ones, that's corrupt behavior. And it's to be stamped on. So there is very widespread corruption because what we do is we separate religion from society, from politics, from economics, and that's the nature. We separate, for example, law from politics. And yet, insidiously, this is a fictional, hypothetical separation, and we find these things can't, in life, be separated. It's extremely difficult to keep out all other considerations. Even things like if you're appointing someone to a job, you are meant to do it on merit, but you may well look at the person, you may like them, or you may think they're elegant or beautiful or whatever, and that could be considered a form of corruption. So it's very widespread, and the characteristic form it takes, for instance, in relation to politics and economics in America, is that you become very rich and then you influence the political system. Or, as we see now, you become president and you start appointing judges and Supreme Court justices and so on. And the barrier supposedly between law and politics is eroded and maybe destroyed. So there is a very widespread but fairly minor corruption. When I say minor, there have been periods in English history when if you wanted to become a nobleman or whatever, you just bought it. And you could buy many privileges, and money would go a very long way in politics and elsewhere. But we have tried through an independent civil service and so on, and an independent judiciary, and through paying people pretty well for important jobs like being judges, the amount of corruption of the legal system has been kept within bounds. But when you get to many parts of the world, certainly from the Western point of view, they say, oh, look how corrupt it is. And that's because it's much more difficult, and it has been much more difficult, to keep these things separate. It's partly the nature of non-Western societies. The family is much more important, and therefore, if you are in a job and your nephew applies, of course you try and wangle him into a job. That's the duty of an uncle. And in many societies, the way senior people make most of their income is through small bribes from people below them. And in many of these societies, particularly the centre of the system doesn't have much money, and so it basically gives out jobs to people with a very small salary, if anything, and says live off the proceeds of what you can do. And of course what you can do is to ask people for money or other benefits when they want some favour. So if they need a license or they need a second car or whatever it is, you get a kickback. And I've seen this very widely in different parts of the world, not just in third world countries, but I've heard about it a lot in the Mediterranean, in Austria and Italy and so on, where sometimes it's not direct money, but for example, some of my academic friends say, when I ask them what they do, they say, well, my formal job is being a lecturer here, but I get paid very little, so I have to also do 3 other jobs, maybe academic or non-academic, to earn a living. And that's the case. Moonlighting is the case in many economic environments. In traditional China, for example, the mandarins, the government didn't have enough to pay the mandarins, so they were appointed as a local official, and they were later in China, they were only there for 3 years, and they just had to make as much money as they possibly could. So particularly with legal cases, they would dismiss cases if there was a payment. And I've heard about this all over India, where you have a series of payments from the street corner salesman who pays the local policeman who pays, and so on, up to the minister. It's very difficult to eradicate this, and some people have anti-corruption campaigns, but since, as the famous saying goes, all power tends to corrupt, even the people who get into power saying they will eliminate corruption often fail. But the last thing to remember is that actually in many economies and societies, a small amount of corruption, which often cuts through regulations, bureaucracies, slowing up economic and other transactions, a small amount of modified corruption may well be a necessary part. It's like the informal or black economy. The white and formal economy would collapse in many places if you didn't have the informal economy. Likewise, many systems would collapse if you entirely eradicated corruption. So you can overdo the fear and hatred of corruption, even though we all hope that when you are playing the game of life, all the rules and laws of the game will be applied to everyone fairly equally. So it's not something to be obsessed about, and it's often blamed for things which it doesn't actually cause. So I've tried, but occasionally we're all weak, and I'm sure I've given in to some minor form of corruption or other. But that was the goal I was taught through my education. Don't be corrupt. Live a clean, modest, sensible, compartmentalized life, and don't let your emotion or your money or your power get out of hand. Thank you.